The Financial Times has made it a business book of the month for March, which also we're really pleased about. And in two of the markets that we can see, the Amazon Kindle markets, we are biotech bestsellers. Number 3, up to as high as number 3 in the UK market. We've been up to number 6 in the US. We're also in the top 3 of new biotech releases. And that's tough competition because apparently science fiction and fantasy is included in that category. So there are quite a few books to have a chance to pass. Having said that, what we're going to do is spend a few minutes walking through 2 topics that we think are really key. One is one of the main thrusts of this book, which is to demonstrate that the biotech industry is actually the industry that's performing to bring us the new drugs. And Don's going to tell us some more about that. And then I'm going to spend a little time talking about a topic very close to my heart, biotech entrepreneurship. And the entrepreneurship discussion doesn't just affect biotech. It's about entrepreneurship generally to some extent. And we'll make sure we give you a quiz at the end. So with that, why don't I hand off to Don? And he's got a few slides and I have a few also. And feel free to ask questions or ask for clarifications. So Don, it's all yours.
Terrific. Thanks very much, everybody. And thanks especially to Cindy for doing the slides. I just wanted to make sure that everybody can see the slides. And if you have a choice between seeing the slides and seeing me, I'd opt for the slides if I were you. We're going to start today by talking about the COVID vaccines, which we were chatting a little bit about informally at the beginning, because the story of the COVID vaccines offers really a perfect summary of a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. You think about it, you have a pandemic, all of a sudden there's this new potentially deadly disease, and you want to try to find a way to make a vaccine to it. And there are several ways to do that, and a number of them are tried and true. And the question was, what will work really well and really quickly to try to stop this pandemic from spreading as rapidly as it could have? And so altogether, there have been 276 vaccines put into development for COVID. Many of them based on those tried and true technologies that have been used in the flu and polio and all that sort of thing. And at the time, the #1 company in the whole world was GSK in vaccine sales, research, and development. And they were working with a brand new technology called mRNA, messenger RNA. And that was a possibility for a fast and effective COVID vaccine. In the labs, they had a group that was expert in mRNA technology, and they wanted to develop for GSK a vaccine against COVID based on that technology. And so they do what you do in a big company is you put together a proposal and you send it up the committee ladder to get approval to get resources, because this was a brand new project. Nobody knew COVID was coming. And despite their expertise in the technology and the importance of COVID, ultimately senior management said, as you can see here, it's not ready for prime time. We're not prepared to invest, our money and our reputation in using an untried and untested technology against COVID. And so while they were not doing it, a little company in Germany called Biotech and a not much bigger company in the US called Moderna decided they could do it. And they basically designed COVID vaccines using mRNA technology over the weekend and set about trying to turn it into reality. And they didn't have a bunch of committees they had to go to. They raised money from investors, and investors were hoping that they would, do something good with it. and this is what they tried. And the rest is history. $50 billion in sales of COVID vaccines later, GSK is no longer the #1 vaccine company. And many of us on this call, maybe most of us, were the beneficiaries of a vaccine that used a technology that the world's best experts thought would probably not work. And it's really how innovation happens when the experts think it's too risky is what our book is about and what our industry is about. So we did a study, and our book talks at great length about this, and I won't, but it basically compares the productivity of the pharmaceutical industry, which is about 85 companies. And these are the names, you know, Pfizer and Glaxo and Bristol Myers and all the companies that were in the drug development business before 1976, which is when Genentech, sort of the model biotech company, was founded. Biotech companies are any company founded since then that's trying to develop new drugs. So it doesn't matter what technology they use, doesn't matter how they're going after it or what diseases they're interested in. If they're young and inexperienced and by and large don't really know what they're doing, they're a biotech company. And if they've been doing it for the better part of 100 years, they have a lot of experience, they have scale, scope, and massive resources, they're a pharmaceutical company. And over the time period we looked at, we saw that the pharmaceutical industry spent on novel drug development $1.6 trillion. This is over just short of 20 years. And biotech spent about a third of that. But the big difference, even bigger than, you know, all that money, is that pharma spent more doing fewer things. So they have 500 new programs a year, roughly, across all the major pharmas. And by the way, when we look at that 1.6 trillion, about 70% of that is spent by just the 12 largest companies. So they've kind of concentrated a lot of expertise into picking the best 5 programs every year. Meanwhile, biotech is doing lots of things, many thousands of things that pharma might have looked at, but decided was not ready for prime time. So the next thing we look at is, well, what happened? You know, when you look for the results of the 2,300 shots on goal versus 500 shots on goal, did the experts win, or did the relatively large number of less experienced people have a shot? And the results, as you see on the next slide, are basically that biotech companies created more innovative, important new medicines called priority review drug approvals, I'll tell you about that in a minute, than the pharmaceutical industry. And they did it with substantially less money. Priority review, it's interesting. If you think about FDA approvals, what you need to show is that the drug is safe and effective, but you don't have to show it's any better than medicines that currently exist. So it can be just like other medicines, or it can be a different formulation of other medicines. But as long as it's just as good, it's good enough. But for priority review, you have to be better. You have to do something that medicine has not done before, and it has to be for a serious disease. I really think when you and I think about like medical advances, this is what we're thinking about. A serious disease in which the treatment opportunities are better than they were before the medicine came along. And what we saw was that all these little companies managed to come up with more important new drugs than the experienced, very thoughtful pharmaceutical companies that had all the same technologies, like the mRNA, but chose to use them differently or chose not to use them at all. So what is it that's made all these little 5,000 companies with an average number of 50 employees? What's made them different? Why is it they've got the greater share of the most innovative drugs? And it's really about how they make decisions to do things. So in pharma, everything goes up the chain of command to a small number of people on the central funding committee for research. And we talked to a bunch of pharmaceutical executives. Lisa and I have done collaborations with many pharmaceutical companies. We've worked with them. And basically anything that they're going to do, that they're going to devote money and people to, has to be approved by a small group of folks. And they are the world's experts. They got Nobel Prize winners advising them. You can't be smarter about this. Whereas in biotech, you've got 5,000 companies. There are 3,500 or more different investors, angels, venture capitalists, the many biotech companies that have gone public but are still developing things. They're not actually commercial companies. And as a result, you have lots more people who are willing to try lots of different things. And if it sounds like a good story, even if it's a risky one, they'll give it a try. And at the end of the day, what happens is those 3,500 plus investors enable biotech companies to try many more things. Over the course of the 20 years of our study, biotech companies tried 40,000 different things, and only 138 worked. So their hit rate's not very good. Pharmaceutical industry tried 8,000 different things, and 99 of them worked. So their odds of success are higher, but they aren't able to innovate as much because they weed out the wild and crazy ideas. And just a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize went to these new cancer immunotherapy advances called checkpoint inhibitors. And the Nobel Prize committee, in their citation to the scientists who discovered the pathway, said this ended up being developed by a small biotech company because none of the pharmaceutical companies were willing to do it. It wasn't because it was bad science, it was great science. It just looked like risky science. And that's what their committees do. They kind of narrow the scope. And if you want to do something where you really don't know what the answer is going to look like, is it mRNA? Is it an old-fashioned vaccine? Is it something else? Do you need a magic bullet or whatever? You're better off trying lots of different things in parallel and seeing what works. And that's the message of the biotech industry. And it's the message of at least one good chunk of the book. So thanks for listening to my story of innovation. It's an exciting one and a good explanation for the title of the talk I give every year at a business school, which is, why are there 5,000 biotech companies? I mean, that seems terribly inefficient. But the answer to that is we need lots of different companies trying lots of different things if we're really going to kind of come up with the new, exciting, creative ideas. So thanks very much. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Don. Let me actually just make one other point. Don just told you about the Nobel Prize for the checkpoint inhibitors. What he didn't tell you is that it was his company that went forward with that technology and brought it to the world. And it's now being copied. Of course, one of the things the pharma companies do really well is they look for their own version of something that's already succeeded. Again, it's a question of trying to squeeze risk out. I also think one of the things that happens in the pharma companies, and this is to address Peter's question earlier, is that people become very focused on the success of their careers and their departments. They don't necessarily want to be associated with a failure. They want to be associated with things that work. So unlike in a biotech company where if something goes wrong, everybody runs into the hallway and says, what can we do to fix the problem? The pharma person might think, oh, good, one less competitor if something went wrong in another department. So we have a very different environment between the two, not just in terms of approach to risk and willing to be dedicated to new projects, but also in terms of how people think about what they'd like to accomplish. And biotech entrepreneurs really want to improve medicine. That's their goal. They want to succeed as a business, but they have this desire to move forward, and they have a lot of belief in that. And that's, I think, one of the things that's really exciting about being an entrepreneur. You have a sense that you could change the world. So let's talk a little bit, looking at the next slide, on who the entrepreneurs are in biotech and what they do. First of all, I think many people believe that a biotech entrepreneur is probably a scientist, someone who made an exciting discovery and now wants to move that forward. But as you started to get a hint from Don's talk, the job is much more than managing the scientific research. The job is going to involve creating a company and finding the resources for it and moving projects forward. So one of the things we look at is, who are the people who do this? And this may come as a surprise. In a public company CEO survey based on documents that public companies filed, we learned that biotech CEOs are the most highly educated executives in any industry. 85% have advanced degrees. Over 2/3 have doctorates. 7% have 2 doctorates. And we also see that 40% of biotech CEOs attended the most competitive colleges. That's compared to 11% of Fortune 700 CEOs. And the proportion of doctorates and advanced education is much, much higher in biotech CEOs than it is in other industries. So let's look at the next slide to think about why you need to be so highly educated. Why are these people drawn to biotech, and why is biotech as an industry drawn to them? First of all, the complexity of an entrepreneur's responsibilities. We've just talked about, it's not just the science idea, it's everything to build the company and to work through a complicated regulatory and financing environment. On top of that, you need to develop expertise in a wide variety of areas and coordinate everyone. My early years in biotech, I used to say my job title was where most needed, that basically, you can't say something's not your job in a little biotech company that has limited resources. You need to make project, and everybody has to pitch in. You need to learn about things, and also to really try to integrate and overcome the complexities of developing a new drug. Biotech executives need a very broad understanding of many different aspects of building a company. So they're constantly learning, and this is where the education matters. You know, one thing about having a PhD, anyone else who has one, I think will agree, it's a degree that teaches you how to learn. It doesn't really matter what your subject is, as much as it is that you become a person who learns how to take in new information, analyze it, integrate it. So I think there's a good reason why we have these people. And let's talk just a little more detail about what the entrepreneurs are doing. So first, there's creating the idea. And in some of the very early stage companies, you know, companies that are spinning out of universities, for example, out of labs and universities, creating the idea is what happens. And the entrepreneur may very well be a person who was involved in creating the ideas, who goes around and looks for support to make this happen. The next thing that person has to do, whoever creates the idea and is working on the project, they have to assemble the resources. That may be a lab, it may be the right people, it may be regulatory experts, but there's lots and lots of resources that you need to find. And then they have to be organized to carry the project forward. And on top of all that, the CEO needs to run the organization. So it's a job with a lot of moving parts. Now, let's go and see what else makes it interesting and difficult to be an entrepreneur. Don just told you about success rates. The vast majority of the products that go into development just don't work. Products that get into the clinic, only 10% succeed. So even though you have great science, you have a good rationale for what you develop, there's just so much we don't know about disease. We just haven't solved all its mysteries, and we haven't necessarily solved all the mysteries of the products or the technologies we're developing. So when we're especially venturing into new areas, unmet medical needs, there are a lot of unknowns. And that means that a person who does this kind of work needs to be able to deal with that that, find the resources, maintain their belief, and inspire others and organize others to move forward and to overcome the challenges of almost nothing working, of convincing skeptical investors, and of maximizing progress when you have very limited resources. So you have a constant need for problem solving. I think that if nothing else, a biotech entrepreneur goes into work and says, oh, what will I have to fix today? And being able to accept the fact that there are problems and fix them is a very important part of the job. So let's look at the next slide and talk about one of the key starting points. Entrepreneurs need to raise money. No matter how good an idea is, it's just not going to finance itself. And creating a financeable organization requires more skills, again, than a scientist might have, because we've talked about enterprise building, but we also need to look at communication and sales skills, because biotech entrepreneurs need to go out and convince others, just like the people inside a pharma company have to convince their central committee. Well, biotech entrepreneurs are out there trying to convince those thousands of investors and potential partners that they are the ones that deserve support and that can succeed. So perseverance is an absolute key to making biotech work. Let's take a look at the next slide and just talk briefly about another important skill. People who work in biotech really believe in what they're doing. They believe in their technology. There's a wonderful story, I think, about the couple who work in Moderna. When they would go on vacation, they would take suitcases full of scientific papers with them. And that's how they would enjoy their time together, looking at new science that fascinated and thrilled them. So it's a given that the entrepreneurs are very committed and love what they're doing and believe in it. Investors are in a slightly different boat. They believe in the industry. Obviously, many of them, we're talking about specialty investors, but we have to remember that someone who has money to invest received that money from an investor of their own, and it's their job to deliver a return on it. So biotech investors not only have to believe in the science, but they also need to put themselves in the mind of the investor. And they have to be able to explain to an investor why investing with that company will give them a return on the investment that satisfies their obligations. So they have to put the science in a business context. And venture capitalists will choose companies that have the best possibility of a profitable exit. No, so they're not thinking as much about who has the most interesting or exciting science. They're thinking about where there's a market, usually through an IPO, especially over the last few years, or a trade sale, selling the company to another company or selling assets of the company to another company. So now the biotech investor is the person who's driving the company forward, but the biotech entrepreneur really needs to form a partnership where they're both sharing goals and understanding each other's goal. Let's look at what a good pitch would be. You know, people talk a lot about how do you get the attention of the investors? How do you get them to work with you and notice what you're doing? When I used to give presentations at investor conferences or when I would do roadshows and go around and meet with various investors, I would say to myself, when I leave this meeting, if they remember one thing about the company, that will be great. What do I want that one thing to be? If I'm incredibly successful, they'll remember two things about this meeting. These people sit in meetings all day long, whether it's an investor conference or in their offices, and people are coming to them all day, every day, reviewing opportunities. So your job when you're making a pitch is to highlight the one thing, put it front and center, make sure it's the one thing that makes sense to the investor because it shows them a pathway forward to a return on investment. So you want to keep it short, keep it focused, and find a very straightforward way to remember and describe the company that you can share with them. So I once saw a woman at an investor conference where we had a very short amount of time less than 10 minutes to make our presentation, she read her patent numbers to the audience. I thought, okay, first of all, if you don't have a patent, you shouldn't be here. And if they become interested enough, they'll go and they'll look at your patents. So you probably don't need to share the numbers today. But this is what I mean about the kinds of communication issues entrepreneurs need to deal with. We all need to get out of our own universe and translate what we're saying into the language of investors. And that's where making a pitch, a perfect pitch, succeeds. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Now, once you get some financing commitments, now we've done the really hard part, right? We have some money, but we still need to manage the ongoing investor relationships. One of my favorite stories, and it is in the book, is a biotech investor told me once what the most important thing was about a company. And the answer was management, management, management. And then the punchline, management that will step aside. Because when things don't work, the knee-jerk reaction is often to say, well, we'll just get a new CEO. There can't be anything wrong with our special technology. So there's an ongoing challenge to keep the investors on board, to help them see that you're doing your job well. On top of that, when you have that money, you need to hire and convince key personnel to do a great job for you. And you need to consider different kinds of models. For example, there are now more and more virtual biotech companies where there's a very, very tiny staff, maybe even only 1 or 2 people, and everything can be outsourced and purchased as needed. Even though it might be more expensive on an individual basis, it's not as expensive as owning, for example, a big lab or a manufacturing facility. So the person, again, doing this job needs to be constantly analyzing and looking for a way to succeed when resources are limited. Next slide. Okay. Now there's another set of challenges we haven't really talked about. So on top of everything else, first we have to have a good idea, then we have to find money, then we have to build an organization, we have to convince people to support us. Everybody needs to deal with the US FDA or the agencies around the world, like the European Medicines Agency. And what is possible in the world of these regulatory agencies will influence your strategy and decisions. You know, Dawn talked a lot about the key new products. And if you don't get a special approval process, then the route to approval can be much more expensive and much more time consuming and maybe beyond the capabilities of the biotech company. So you have to figure out a path to regulatory approval. That's why unmet medical needs are an important area, not just because people need new medicine, but because you have a more rapid review, for example, when you get to the FDA. It doesn't mean they review less, it's that they give you shorter timelines. So they give you a 6-month review instead of a 12. They put all the people on it to do the job in a shorter period of time. One of the most important things that I believe a biotech company also needs to be considering when they're thinking about what products to develop and what treatments they should create is what patients need. I believe that biotech companies need to always think about the patients who are waiting, who are counting on us, the patients who are trusting us to bring something for them when there's nothing else available. And that, to me, is the highest mission of the biotech company. And it's a very exciting moment when it works. And it's very exciting that the industry has been able to make such a difference and have such an impact on the world because we're risk takers and because we're dedicated. And again, all within the context of limited resources. So I think that these challenges are high bars, but being able to overcome them is a really wonderful goal and something to feel really good about when it works. And when it doesn't work, to say, we'll make it work next time, and to persevere and to move on and believe that there are still great possibilities out there. So this concludes my discussion of what a biotech entrepreneur does. But now I'd like to take a few minutes and talk to you all about whether you're an entrepreneur. So this is a quiz I've developed. I use it with students quite a bit. I give a talk at a business school in the UK every year, and a lot of the students are interested in entrepreneurship. And I ask them to think about themselves in the light of these questions. And this is based primarily on my own experience. There isn't a lot of academic study about who the entrepreneurs are and what they're in terms of their personal qualities. But let's start with the first one. Do you always think there is a better way to do something? Mr. Don's parents, when he was a child, had a nickname for him. They called him the efficiency expert. And I think that was probably a well-earned nickname. So there are people who just look at things and think, you know, I think I could improve that. I think there's a better way forward. I think that is a hallmark of an entrepreneur. Now, the next point has already been brought up a little bit. Are you willing to do just about anything, even if you don't know much about it? I can't tell you how many times I had to sit down and study something and figure out how to do something I'd never done before because there was no one else to do it. And I think most entrepreneurs will tell you that they have to do the same thing. And it might be something as mundane as how to fill out a form to send an FDA submission in that the regulatory person forgot to do before they went home for the weekend, or it might be something far more significant. So there's this willingness to sort of explore broadly and to trust yourself, to work hard and to figure things out. Now, there's another really important point. You can do everything right in biotech. You can conduct your trials properly. You can do all your science correctly. You can work well and make sure that you make good, timely progress. But that doesn't mean that what you do will work. And for some people, that's exhilarating to think that there's a small chance of success and that they could be the person that does that. But other people might like a more well-defined path. And I want to point out, these are not right or wrong answer questions. This is more of a self-assessment question. There are people who like to know that when they go to work, there's a path of work they can do. If they do it and do it well, that's successful. And that's a good thing. And there are lots of jobs where that's really important. And we need people to do that work. But biotech entrepreneurs need to accept the fact that they will be taking risks and they in fact might not succeed despite a lot of hard work and doing things well. Okay. Now, here's I think a corollary of that. Do you like to take on new tasks or do you prefer routine? And by routine, I don't necessarily mean boring routine, but I mean, for example, having a kind of position where you have a set of skills and a really good body of knowledge, and you know that you can apply yourself using those on a regular basis. And that's satisfying to a lot of people. I think, for example, a lot of legal work might fit in that category. Other people say, oh, I've been there, I've done that. I'd like to try something new. And they just can't imagine doing the same thing over and over. So again, this is just a self-assessment idea. And let's move on to a couple of things that I think are really key. Can you accept rejection and failure? Whenever I would go to an investor meeting, before I went in to the meeting to begin the talk, I would always think to myself, I don't expect them to buy any shares today. I don't expect an investment. And then when I entered the meeting and I found out they were already shareholders or that they'd planned to place an order, for example, if it was a stock offering, I would think, well, that's really great. You know, that's something that I didn't expect, that's going really well, and it's just what we need. So I didn't expect to be perfect. I didn't expect to succeed at everything I tried. What I expected was the last point, which is to keep trying until something worked. And I also remember sitting with two very distinguished cancer researchers in the UK in the early days of antibodies. And this was actually before rituximab was approved, which became this really wonderful cancer therapy that's done so much for the world. And the two of them told me that antibodies would never treat cancer, especially solid tumors. And they were very eminent, very distinguished scientists. I was trying to convince them to do some work with us. And, I just looked at them, I said, we really believe that antibodies will do that. And we believe our technology will make that happen. Now, 20 years later, of course, there's nothing more important right now for cancer treatment in terms of new therapies than monoclonal antibodies. And there have been so many of them. But it's not necessarily an easy thing to have people who have a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill tell you that you're just wrong and that what you're doing won't work. So entrepreneurs need to be able to handle that kind of comment and be able to make their own decision and be able to just keep working away at something until it succeeds. So that's my quiz, and I would love to hear your comments on it. I also think maybe a question or two came up in the chat. So first of all, let me thank you all for joining. And now we'd love to open up for comments and questions and make sure that we get the questions. How long PhDs in religion? Okay. Okay. So we've got a question about how 2 PhDs in religion made the transition. So in Don's case, he's also an attorney, and he can tell you his story. In my case, I was actually working at the university after I finished my doctorate, and Don had started a company called Medarex, and he had like 3 months worth of money. So I helped him, and I ended up going into biotech just because he didn't have anybody to work for him. And I loved it. And after Medarex went public, they offered me a full-time job, and I never looked back, and turned out to be a great fit. I do think that, as I said, having a doctorate is a great preparation for this field. I'm also trained as a historian. Historians we're focused on data and being analytical, being careful, doing things correctly, verifying what we're doing. So in some ways, my training it was a good fit for the intellectual side of biotech. Don, do you want to make any comment on your transition?
The short version of a long story is I was a lawyer for a chemical company. Our chairman got cancer. When you think of our chairman, think of a Donald Trump-like, cigar chomping character. And he wanted the company to invest in cancer diagnostics and treatments because they might help him. And he brought me into a meeting and said, I want to sign these documents today to invest in this cancer company. And as a company lawyer, I'm supposed to read the documents. I said, when would you like to sign them? And he said, like, right now. Like I was just about to pull out my pen, and I said, well, maybe I'd like to read them first, if that's possible. And he said, well, we'll take a break. So I take a break. I go into my office, call my college roommate, who is by this point a medical school professor. And I said to him, my company is about to invest in something that does monoclonal antibodies. Can you tell me what they are and how you can tell a good one from a bad one? This is back in like 1984, 1985. It's pretty early on. And so he gave me a couple of buzzwords, and I wrote them down phonetically, went back in the meeting, used the buzzwords, and the next day, the chairman put me in charge of our biotech effort. So that was my very accidental and surprising transition into biotech. And ultimately, we ended up finding some other technology also involving monoclonals, because that's what I was an expert in. And that spun out and became the company that we just talked a little bit about.
Kimberly, I see a note from you about liberal arts majors feeling like square pegs and round holes. Kimberly, by the way, I'm so glad to say hello to you. She very kindly invited the Virginia and Washington crowd. Can you elaborate on your question a little bit?
Yeah, well, the kinds of, forgive me, I'm out walking while I'm watching, I'm multitasking. The kinds of things that you're talking about in terms of being an entrepreneur, being willing to learn new things, to, take on whatever needs to be done, to be comfortable in all the unknown and everything else. That to me seems like a lot of what we, as from the liberal arts perspective, learning how to think, being analytical, critical, knowing how to write, knowing how to speak to other people, all these things. And what I'm talking about is that, I guess throughout most of my 40-year career, it's just felt like it, certainly as time has gone on, that increasingly feeling like that square peg trying to fit in a round hole. Everybody wants you to be this thing and drill down deep when you're wide and broad, or interested in a lot of things, or capable of doing who knows what, including, like Don said, becoming an expert on monoclonal antibodies when he just wrote down the words phonetically and he didn't really know anything about it, but that's okay. That's what I mean, of people feeling that they need to be pigeonholed because that's how the world wants to see them, or that's how companies, large big ones, want to utilize our skills and talents and our brains.
Kimberly, you sound like an entrepreneur to me. The anti-silo mentality.
Yeah, I've been an entrepreneur my whole career, and it's been challenging, but at the same time, I always say, well, if they've never done it before, and I'm doing it for the first time, they can't tell me I'm doing it wrong because they don't know how to do it either.
Here,
Well,
here.
that probably won't stop them, but that doesn't mean they're right.
Doesn't stop me. So there you have it.
Thank you for that. I think I got the questions in the chat. Any other questions that we can answer?
I'll do one. So how is a company like Theranos able to exist for as long as it did before find out? And with that technology that she was working on, is that something that's viable?
Well, let me take a short comment on that, and I'm sure Don would like to add something. Fraud is very unusual in our industry, and the reason has to do with one of the people who's on our call. People publish their results, they file patent applications. If you are talking to potential partners, they'll often want some materials maybe that they can experiment with. They'll try to duplicate your experiments. But I think the thing to remember is that biotech is, to a certain extent, a specialized field, and most investors are specialty investors. Not all of them. There are generalist investors who will decide to go into a stock. That's usually on the basis of market conditions rather than biotech specialty. What we do know about Theranos is that they did not go the traditional route. They found people to sit on their board, and people who invested in the company who didn't actually do the normal due diligence that biotech investors would do. So in the case of Theranos, they found a way to convince people they had something really special without actually demonstrating that the science behind it worked. Don, would you like to add something to that?
Only that to go to Margie's question about is something like what they were trying to do possible. The answer is people have tried to do that for a long time, and it's proved to be extremely difficult. It's not, I mean, you never know what you can achieve, and biotech does lots of wild and crazy things. But that was one that was, let's say, it seemed surprising that it was working. Wish it had worked out, but I don't think it's a typical message. I think it's an outlier. We've had thousands of biotech companies who've come and gone over the years, and unfortunately, our book is coming out right behind the one sort of outlier example of a company that was, doesn't necessarily fit the mold so well. It's a good question, The book about it, which I haven't read, but everybody raves about, will ensure that we will never be #1 on the biotech bestsellers list.
Any other questions we can answer?
Yeah, Lisa, I took the quiz and I failed in 4 of the 7, but I've found that being an entrepreneur and being a politician are a lot alike, because you have to get used to people telling you it won't work. So you have to persist. And I've enjoyed very much your presentations, and they opened my eyes to things that I was unaware of, and really appreciate the education that I've gotten today.
Oh, thank you, especially David, because we know you already had your classmates filling your head full of ideas an hour before this.
Okay, perfect. Lisa,
Okay.
I do have another question for you.
Sure.
If you have a moment to do that. When I lived in Houston, I was part of the fledgling the biotech industry group. This was back in the, I think, early 90s. And I do recall a couple of biotech companies there at the time, but it just seemed like, okay, the strategy was to get this thing going, to develop it enough, and then to hope for big pharma to buy you. Is that something that I guess the management of many of these smaller biotech companies that are doing all this great innovation and research are seeking? Are they seeking to be like the Modernas of the world, who come up through it without that happening?
So funding and exit models have waxed and waned over the years in the industry, depending on what's possible. For example, over the last few years, the financing market has been extraordinarily strong, the strongest it's ever been. So companies have been able to raise a lot of money and to move forward very well with their own product development and to look into broadening what they do. Having said that, there have been plenty of times in our industry where there was almost impossible to raise money. And so people hope to reach a milestone where they could find a partner who would either buy the product or buy the company. And even today, there are lots of venture capitalists who might start a company that they think would be great for a trade sale because they need an exit in a reasonable timeline. I mean, one thing to think about is as the development timelines are very, very long. There's so many barriers to entry. I mean, it's not just that you need regulatory approval, it's all the work you have to do together, conduct clinical trials, develop a manufacturing process. So that some of it depends on what's possible at any one moment in time. And there are some people who might think it would be a great thing to be serial entrepreneurs, so they want to develop something and move on. Then there are others who would love to make the transition to a bigger, more permanent company. So you'll see some of all of that in the industry.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's been a lot of fun. We spent longer than we like to admit working on this book, and we're so happy that it's out there and that we can share with you our insights and our experiences. We hope it's interesting. We hope it informs your own decisions about your future and about your lives generally. And we hope it's just a good read. Don, anything you'd like to add to that?
Just thank everybody and appreciate your joining us today.
Okay, great.
Thank you.